this is somebody's dead child, how could I possibly do it justice? But then something interesting happens actually in the mind of a creative. You don't have to fix it. In fact, you can't fix it. If someone tells you their baby died, the worst has already happened. 6 babies are stillborn in Australia every day. 2 pass away as neonates, which means in the first 28 days of life.
Don't be caught dead. The show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today, I am speaking with Larissa Reinboth. She is someone who is turning art into a form of grief support and advocacy. Larissa is an artist, a child's author, illustrator, and the founder and director of the Australian charity Possum Portraits, a unique organisation supporting families after miscarriage, stillbirth, and neonatal death through free memorial portraits, education, and bereavement resources. Originally from Germany and now based in Melbourne, Larissa's path has been anything but conventional. Before leading a national charity, she worked across industries and countries, living in Europe, South America, and Australia. She holds a master's degree in illustration and book arts and has combined her artistic practice with a deep commitment to improving perinatal bereavement care. The idea for Possum Portraits began after Larissa's sister, a midwife, recognised a gap in support for bereaved parents, particularly access to meaningful keepsakes after the death of a baby. What started as a commissioned illustration evolved into a registered charity providing free memorial portraits and advocating for better support for grieving families. Larissa has also experienced miscarriage herself and has channeled lived experience into practical support tools, including the children's grief book, The House in Ollie's Tummy, helping families explain pregnancy and baby loss to siblings and young children. In today's episode, we'll explore grief after baby loss, memory making, art as healing, and why society still struggles to talk openly about miscarriage and stillbirth. Thank you so much for being with us today, Larissa.
Thanks for having me. It's a really exciting opportunity.
So tell me in the timeline about your own personal experience when you had the conversation with your sister and recognized that there was a gap in the market.
Well, so that was back in Germany in 2018. She had just experienced her first stillbirth as a caregiver, so as a midwife. She attended the stillbirth of a baby, and it really affected her, something that many people sort of in the general public don't realize. Obviously, it's a traumatic experience for the parents, but it doesn't leave the caregivers who attend that birth unaffected. And especially, as a young professional in the field, she felt like the commemorative possibilities that were being utilized at the time weren't really as respectful as they could be, or weren't really appropriate. And so, because I have a degree in illustration, she reached out to me and she just wanted to do something else for those parents. She said, how do you feel about drawing a dead baby? And I sort of went, what do you mean? Like it's something that you don't really, at first you think it's a bit macabre and, a little bit on the nose, and you don't understand just how helpful it is, because you think, as a general person who has until that point not familiarized themselves with that domain, you think that parents sort of just want to forget about their baby, which is exactly the opposite of what happens. Just like any parent, bereaved parents love their baby, want to see their baby, feel connected to their baby, and want to be able in some way to live out that relationship that they have with this child. And when it dies, that's a relationship that gets prematurely cut short. And so my sister felt strongly that she would like to give bereaved families something that would help them nurture that relationship going forward. So yeah, that's when I started drawing perinatal loss portraits initially, just as a commission process, for individual families after loss. A few newspapers in Germany ran articles about the work I do. And then in 2020, I moved to Melbourne with my partner and my then 7-month-old daughter. And the pandemic struck, and like so many people, I took a bit of, I took stock and I went, oh, what do I really want to do with this time? What would I like to do going forward? And I thought, I really, based on the feedback that I got from parents in Germany, I understood how helpful those portraits were. And I said, I really want them to be free. I want everyone to have access to these, and money shouldn't be, a limiting factor for who can access this portrait service. So that's how we started Possum Portraits.
What was it like when you did your first portrait or commission?
For Possum Portraits?
Yeah.
Oh, it was a watershed moment. I mean, obviously by that point I had drawn heaps of these portraits, but it was a validation of the concept first and foremost, that there was also an interest in this type of grief support in Australia. And it takes a lot of, time and energy and effort to set up a charity. And it was just very rewarding to see that somebody was going to be benefiting from this charity that we'd set up. And it's just, yeah, gone from strength to strength ever since.
When you were back in Germany back in sort of 2018 that you first started this, like, what was the first what was it like to do the first one, the very first one?
Look, my palms were sweating. I was, sitting in front of the empty paper of the blank paper going, oh, I can't do this, like I can't. This is somebody's dead child, how could I possibly do it justice? But then something interesting happens actually in the mind of a creative. You stop seeing the image as such, and it sort of just becomes shapes and light and shade. And that's kind of the way in. You stop seeing the image as such, and it sort of just becomes shapes and light and shade. And that's kind of the way in. That's how you find your groove. And that's how, there's an element of abstraction there for the artist creating these portraits, and in fact also for the viewer. Photographs can be a bit on the nose, and sometimes they're also not the most appropriate form of communication, of commemoration, because sometimes people might be missing from that photographic image. You might be able to see blood and skin tearing, or congenital deformities in a photo. There might be medical equipment, tubes, all these sorts of things that you don't want to be triggered by every single time that you look at a photo of your baby. And so a portrait allows you to sort of have that, like a form of representation that's a degree of removal from reality that helps me make it, and it helps the bereaved parents look at it and other people look at it too, and not feel so confounded with the situation at hand. It can also be personalized, unlike a photo. So sometimes, a mother might not have got the opportunity to have a photo with her baby together. And so lots of portraits that we do are called composites. So we stitch together various photographs to create a keepsake that is, commemorating the baby in the way that the parent wants it to, with perhaps with a sibling or with both parents together, or, in whatever way they want their baby remembered. And so, yeah, portraiture just offers all of these myriad possibilities for commemoration that can be either in addition to or instead of a photo. Just, yeah, very appropriate grief support tools.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because you can almost curate a future that you didn't end up being able to live, and what was in your dreams, by really creating this beautiful portrait of a family that could have been.
That's right. Yeah. And there's obviously something extremely bittersweet in those sorts of images. Sometimes we use older or younger siblings of the baby. And for example, if the photograph is very unclear, sometimes we get Polaroids, so that's another wonderful thing about the service we offer, is that if your loss occurred 30 years ago, and you only have a Polaroid, you can send that in and we can base a portrait on that, and sometimes the image quality isn't great. And so that's something that we can rejuvenate, give yeah, almost like a new memory that you never got to make.
And how was it for you after you'd done the first portrait, that moment where you handed it over to the family?
Yeah. So I sent it in the post because they actually lived in Austria, and it was incredible to receive. They wrote me an email when they got it, and they both said they cried, and how perfect it was and how much it looked like their daughter, and just how thankful they were. And I mean, you can be an artist, earning squillions of dollars and exhibiting in all these fancy galleries and whatnot, and of course that's rewarding in its own way. But, these little portraits, nobody is ever going to really know the name of the artist. You're not going to win an Archibald. You're not going to be a squillionaire, but in terms of the impact that each and every one of these drawings has, there can really be nothing more meaningful or rewarding to a creative person, an artist, an illustrator, than creating something that will literally somebody is going to own until they die.
And what was your experience prior to this sort of conversation that you had with your sister? What sort of work that you were doing? You had done the obviously the qualification, but what were you actually doing? Were you illustrating books? Tell us a little bit about what you were doing prior to this.
So, yeah, I had my little studio in Berlin, and I was actually trying to sort of break into the editorial illustration market, working on my portfolio. I just graduated from my master's. And so I was kind of, yeah, trying to set myself up really. And then this project came along and it sort of just grew feet. As sometimes unexpected things do.
And you've told us a little bit about how you validated the concept when you arrived in Australia in 2020. But tell us a little bit about that sort of experience of how you went from the first illustration in 2018 for the Austrian couple to sort of really the second and third client that you were doing, like
In Australia, you mean?
in in Germany originally, yeah.
Well, I started putting out notices, advertisements. I tried to also, so for example, quite a few news outlets started, writing about the work that I do because there isn't much. There's just like here, there's photography services for, volunteer photographers that come to hospitals to take photos of stillborns, but there really isn't. I mean, there are other artists that offer portraits for free, sorry, for a commission fee, but it's something that's not really, as a society, we don't really like talking about death and grief. Sort of we're sort of in the Western world a little bit grief illiterate in that way. It's a sort of a confronting topic. There's still the sort of underlying understanding that all of this should be, under wraps and somehow endured in silence in a dark corner by yourself. So heaven forbid you don't make anyone else uncomfortable. And yeah, it was kind of a little bit hard to gain traction also because it was a paid service. So hospitals didn't really necessarily feel like they wanted to advertise it because it felt, some of them felt like it would be profiteering of someone else's grief. And so that was one of the reasons why, I completely agreed that it should be a bereavement care service and it ought to be free. So that's why, when we came over here, I set up the charity.
And talk me through that process because talk about a challenging time to move to Australia with a young family and start a business in the middle of COVID just striking.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't really know how I did it, looking back. First time parent with no network here whatsoever. They were, playgroups weren't open, but I didn't have a mother's group because my daughter was born overseas. Then they closed the playgrounds. And I was also living out in the sticks. I think I just needed to do something for myself. I needed to feel like I was building something, doing something constructive, not completely losing myself in this situation of loss of control. And yeah, that's what I chose as what I wanted to be working on.
And we mentioned in the bio that you then had your own personal experience with miscarriage. Are you comfortable to talk us through what happened there?
Yeah, sure. So interestingly, this actually happened before my sister approached me. And it's one of the things that still strike me as, confounding really is because I had had a miscarriage by the time she approached me. And yet the system is so intent on kind of covering all that up and hushing it up and not making it seem like a big deal that it literally, it felt, it felt like I went to hospital for a broken leg or something, like someone to put a cast on. It was not really acknowledged by the healthcare personnel at all, even though I sat in the corridor crying after my DNC. My mum came with me, and I even remember the doctor who performed the operation, just happened to be walking past when I was, sitting there sobbing into my mum's shoulder. And he sort of stopped dead in his tracks and he looked at me and he went, "What's wrong?" It's like, someone's just had a miscarriage. You've just operated on their womb and you're actually asking them what's wrong. And so my understanding, even despite having had this experience, was that, it's something that shouldn't be talked about, shouldn't be touched. It should just be kind of, you forget and move on type situation. And then when my sister sort of, in the professional capacity of a midwife approached me and said, "Look, this is a thing that you're allowed to be sad about. This is a thing that lots of people are sad about." It just, yeah, it sort of maybe validated some feelings or a sense of closure that I never got to be kind of, yeah, working in this field and trying to ensure that, other people, if I could at all mitigate, not the circumstance, maybe the feelings or the repercussions that somebody had, the feeling of a caregiving environment.
So it must have been really significant for that first family when you handed the portrait and you sent it to them in the mail and waiting to actually receive their feedback.
Yeah. well, it was a heart-throbbing, heart-throbbing moment, and yeah, very validating and rewarding.
And that wasn't the only difference that you've made in relation to your portraiture. We've also talked about the beautiful book that you've written. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about, Larissa?
Sure. So, I have a master's in illustration and book arts. And so one of the things that I've always been drawn to are children's books, just as a personal interest, and I thought, gosh, there's so much potential here to marry the two up. And, I've been thinking about it for a little while. And then in the context of working for Possum Portraits, we got feedback sometimes from parents that they didn't really know how necessarily to talk to their children about what had happened to to the baby, and they couldn't find the right words. They found it maybe confronting. They didn't know if their children were going to be sad, how much to say, how not to say, how what not to say. You're just a parent. You don't know anything about the cognitive processes that go on in bereaved kids, how to best support them. All of a sudden you notice perhaps behavioral issues, things like that. And there wasn't really that much support that parents could readily find to help them navigate parenthood of existing children after they lose a baby. And so I thought, well, there's two birds with one stone if ever I saw one. And so we were looking around for someone to help us co-author this children's book, because I didn't want it to be just a children's book. I wanted it to be a resource that's also supportive of parents' informational and emotional needs at that time. So we reached out to a fantastic grief counselor, and she's actually a professor in thanatology in Santa Fe in the US. And her name's Dr. Corey Lee, and she has experience working in pediatric palliative care. She's also a certified child life specialist, and she just has oodles of experience, qualifications, and skills. And so she consented to read over the manuscript, and then she also wrote the resource section of the book. So the resource section is for parents, teachers, caregivers, anybody supporting a child through loss, and it sort of gives some information on how children process grief very differently to adults, what you can do to help them through this, what behaviors to look out for, what behaviors are completely normal, what sort of questions you might expect, how you might field those questions, all of these sorts of very practical tools that parents were looking for, in their conversations with Possum Portraits. It also includes these commemorative grief support activities that you can do either with ones that are appropriate for children or ones that are appropriate just for grown-ups or to do as a whole family. And it's just a resource wealthy with information. Yeah, and the story of it in and of itself, so the children's book part of the book, it just takes kids through the feelings of grief, really. Introducing the concepts, how to deal with that, maybe how to navigate it as a family, what it is, how it can feel like, why it comes. It also talks very, very plainly about death, uses the words dead, died, which is really important when talking to children about death, not to obfuscate concepts and not to use euphemisms, because it actually confuses them. And you're just going to have to revisit all of that later on when the kids are a bit older. And then you're also going to have to explain away the euphemisms that you use, so it's kind of just layer upon layer of confusion, things like, the baby's gone, like, well, where's it gone to, like, or, the baby's in heaven, then, children have gone on airplanes and told their parents, you said our baby was in the clouds, like I didn't see it, and so children can be very literal, and they're not actually afraid of words like dead and died, just like they're learning words like table and chair and love and things like that. They learn them, and then they learn what they mean. It's us as adults that are uncomfortable talking about these things, and we sort of put this uncomfortableness and this, we're quite ginger around those topics, and children imbibe this emotional response to a word. But if we can be frank about them, that it's just like anything else, it's part of life. This is what it is to be dead. Your body stops working, you don't come back. They're much better able to understand and to process what happened. And processing is so important, especially for children, because it actually informs health outcomes for them developmentally. If just like any childhood trauma, if it sits there unresolved in the back of your mind, it can lead to all sorts of repercussions for yourself, for your family, for your mental health, and possibly even for society later on. So it was important to get that part right.
And it sounds like it was quite Like, it's overwhelming how much you've managed to actually include in this one book. How long did it take you to complete the book writing process?
So I'd been sort of dabbling with the story for quite a while. And then, we had to source funding for it, obviously to write it, to publish it, to illustrate it, to distribute it. Maybe it was about a year to a year and a half all up from the first idea to actually having the finished project or the finished book on my desk, which was a surreal moment. And then it's just gone absolutely just stellar. We're on the third edition now. The Federal Department of Health and Aged Care has actually jumped on board to fund not only the second, but also the third edition of the book. Both of them are print runs of 3,400 copies. And the idea behind that is that the book is now free for bereaved parents all around Australia. We're distributing it to maternity hospitals around the country, and they give it out to parents immediately as their need arises. That was another thing that was really important to me. You don't want to find this book like a year after your baby died. You want to have it right there with you when you come home from hospital and your 3-year-old asks you, "Mummy, where's the baby?" That's when you need it. And so that's the idea behind distributing this to hospitals so that they can send parents home with this communication aid in.
And over that year and a half, given the fact that you already had your own experience back in Germany with miscarriage, and you had actually by this stage obviously done commissions and portraits for numerous families, was there anything that you learned during that process of writing that book?
Yeah, I learned a lot from Corey actually, just like most other people, I was a bit like, oh, should you be quite so frank with kids, about, shouldn't you sort of make it a little bit more pretty, let's say? And no, I learned that absolutely you shouldn't, and that informed my approach to the story and to the way that I illustrated the book. There are realistic characters, we decided not to go with, I don't know, animals or something to make it more abstract and more cutesy. Like the idea of this was to actually be an informative resource that's realistic. And it resonates really well with children. We've done feedback with children on it. We've run, workshops in public libraries. We've even gone into kindergartens and schools to do book readings with them. And they just take it as a given, just like anything else that they learn. Okay, so there's this emotion called grief. What people die, and then that's what we feel. Where do you go when you're dead? You go, you go nowhere. The body stops working, things like that. And so I've learned a new way of talking to kids, and that they're actually way more resilient than we often give them credit for. Yeah, which is great to know. Obviously, as a parent, I'm a parent myself, so I use that approach in my own family.
And tell me, when you've been running these workshops in libraries and in kindergartens and with children, what are some of the responses from the kids? Because I love the fact that they don't have a filter.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the mostly the experiences that children have at this point of their lives, are, for example, the death of pets, the death of grandparents. Not many children in those workshops that we've held have actually had the experience of a bereaved sibling. Some of them have lost a parent, and so, but they are quite frank about it still. Which is one thing that you learn about kids is that they're not continuously in this sort of like deathly, grieving phase. They sort of bounce up and down a bit more. They'll still play. Normally, you think there's nothing wrong with them, and then all of a sudden they might have a, grief burst and act out, or display other kinds of behavior. And so, yeah, that was really interesting to witness that you couldn't tell them apart really from other kids in that short moment of a workshop. And everybody found it really helpful. We did like a craft activity related to the book where everybody got to draw like their grief monster, and it was just activities like that sort of come down to the child's level and help them process things or understand things tactically, visually, sensorially, really help them absorb information and process concepts.
I love that drawing a grief monster.
Yeah.
What do some of them look like?
Oh, we've got, I still have the photo somewhere. They're just like literally anything you can imagine. Some are pink and fluffy and some have lots of teeth and some are like, yeah, just it's incredible what they can come up with.
I love the fact that they're so unique.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so is grief. It's a very
Yeah.
unique experience. No two people are going to have the same experience. Your experience of grief and the way that you navigate it is rooted in personal as well as cultural backgrounds, concepts. And so, yeah, grief is as the individual that experiences it. That's another common misconception, I think, certainly in, in Western societies, is that there's somehow a timeline associated with it, that, at a certain point, although nobody has quite managed to pinpoint that point. But anecdotally, apparently there's supposed to be a point when you are, quote, over it. And then you're supposed to be functioning like a good cog in the machine and stop moping about and just get on with it. And that's unfortunately not how it works.
And how do you experience grief now, given the work that you've done, the so many families that you've walked alongside with in relation to, providing them a keepsake that they would never normally have? Where does your grief sit now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I'm so absorbed in this whole space. There's a real sense of community of being there for each other, supporting each other. Sometimes also, I switch my hats. I have my personal hat and my work hat, and sometimes maybe the personal gets a little bit lost in the just the day to day work that I do for the charity. But it's, I don't know, it's just something that's, you'll never forget about it. There's always that what if, yeah, I look at my daughter and I go, she could have an older sibling. And yeah, there is a bittersweetness to it, definitely still. Yeah.
Did you draw your own portrait for your own child?
No, I couldn't because but it was a miscarriage. And so I didn't have a body to draw. I dealt with it in other ways, but that's unfortunately something that I wasn't able to do. Yeah, I didn't even get the ultrasounds. There's another service that we're working on now, possibly launching with Possum Portraits, is to have ultrasound scans turned into art, because that is actually the experience of many bereaved parents who have early gestation losses, that they haven't got a body of which a photograph could be taken, or a portrait could be drawn. And so, yeah, we're looking whether it's feasible to actually use ultrasounds to make ultrasound art for those parents instead. But that's in the pipeline.
Wow. Well, I think if there's a person that can find a way to do it, I think it's in safe hands with you, Larissa. And tell me, what is the future? You've mentioned that you've just received some funding for the third print run of the books,
Yeah.
and you're working on now the ultrasound artwork possibility. What are the things that keep you moving within the charity?
So there's always more to do. We've just received some funding from the Department of Home Affairs to run a series of art therapy workshops for bereaved parents in Melbourne. That's going to be happening in 2027. Because while the portraits that we do are, incredibly meaningful keepsakes for parents, some people actually feel like they don't want to receive something. They would actually like to do something. They would like to get hands on themselves. And they feel like there's stuff inside them that they would like to get out somehow. And so there's again that process of or the aspect of processing your grief through action, and so that's where the art therapy workshops come in, yeah, to allow parents to get a bit more hands-on in working through their grief. And these workshops, we're also hoping to target multicultural communities, because actually, in terms of the support avenues that are available to culturally and linguistically diverse bereaved parents, it's pretty slim pickings in terms of services that actually meet them where their needs are in terms of language proficiency and services that are particularly aimed at them. So we're hoping to close that gap in equity of resourcing and healthcare there. And yeah, so these art therapy workshops are basically just a pilot, and we hope they go really well. We might be able to include them as an ongoing program for Possum Portraits in the future.
That's an amazing opportunity. We will watch that space as those dates become available in Melbourne. That's amazing. And you've talked about the misconception in relation to grief when it comes to the linear line that we're supposed to go through the certain stages, and how that's completely untrue. all messy and ugly at times. And tell me, what are some of the other things that your work in this space has made you realize that are that another common misconception that people have?
Oh, gee, there's absolute bucket loads.
I'm sure there is.
I mean, again, it's not helped by the fact that it is a topic that generally gets swept under the carpet a little bit because of this ick factor of uncomfortableness, talking about deep feelings. And so that's the perfect breeding ground for misconceptions to arise when they can't be aired through open conversation and, real exchange with people who have experienced this. Thankfully, the trend is that it's changing, but there's still a lot more work to do. So, yeah, one of the misconceptions is that the grief has a timeline, which it does not. People who have experienced stillbirth 40 years ago can still sit on a bus and randomly burst into tears. There's another sort of misconception that somebody's grief in relation to baby loss ought to be somehow proportional to the gestational age at which they lost the baby. So that maybe somebody who experienced miscarriage, doesn't have the right to be as sad as somebody who, experienced neonatal death, But again, it's not really for anyone to tell anyone else how sad they ought to be, like it also doesn't help to try and quantify, and have a hierarchy or a pecking order of, who's allowed to be sadder than somebody else. The idea is to validate somebody's emotions. You don't know how many IVF cycles somebody who's just experienced a miscarriage might have had, how many tens or hundreds thousands of dollars they might have spent to try and conceive. And now they've lost their 10th embryo, at insemination, and they will be absolutely, am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yeah.
Absolutely fucking devastated. And so it's not for you to come along and say, oh, it was just at, I don't know, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. Like, she'll be right now. You could just try again. So there's a lot of, also in this culture that we have of trying to, make everything productive and, not be sort of not sit in grief and let things happen and explore feelings. It's like always on to the next thing and, try and do something to make it go away. If that's a comment or an action or something, you shouldn't be, there's something you can do about that, like there's a medicine or why don't you do something about it type situations, where sometimes you can't or you don't want to do anything about it. You're allowed to be sad. Another misconception is that, women grieve more than men. I would say that the ways in which men and women tend to grieve is definitely distinct. I would make absolutely no presupposition on, the depth of grief, amount of grief between women and men. It's just they show it very differently. Socially and historically, there have been a quote unquote acceptable and unacceptable ways for these genders to show their emotions. And especially in terms of men, that's actually hampering often the support that they receive and the perception of them as grievers. Another misconception is that, siblings aren't really affected because they didn't even know the baby. That is not true. The death of a baby sibling that was born either before or after an existing child is going to carry through their entire lifetime as a might have been. They will remember the exact moment, if not cognitively, so that they actually have concrete memories, but certainly as feeling. Throughout their entire life, they will remember how sad their parents were, what it was like. Perhaps they got to attend the funeral. There's just a very impactful situation for bereaved siblings. Yeah, and then another very common misconception that the general or that members of the general public often have is that you shouldn't talk about the dead baby to the parents because it's going to be triggering, it's going to upset them, and it sort of ought to be like a hush hush. You kind of let them stew in their grief, basically. I'm not saying there's anything malicious about it, but people don't really know what to say. They don't want to obviously upset the parent, But the truth is that just like any parent, parents want to talk about their kids. If you don't talk about it, it's just like it never existed. You're just basically denying and invalidating that person's experience. You can talk about the baby. You can ask how labor was. You can ask what the baby looked like. Certainly ask what its name was. Refer to the baby by its name if you know what it's called. Think of the parents on the birth or the death anniversary. I'm not saying you have to send a bunch of flowers every year, but you can, depending on what your relationship is with this person, you can just send an emoji and say, look, I'm thinking of you, it must be a difficult day. And if you want to go for a walk, I don't know, for a coffee, I'm here. Because you can bet your bottom dollar that the parent is going to be thinking about their baby, and you're not reminding them they're already thinking about that their child anyway. And so, yeah, people are allowed to lose a little bit of this sort of hesitancy to touch and to interact and engage with the topic. Especially if somebody tells you, I've had a miscarriage, or, or you're in the park, or I don't know, it's common, for example, for parents of living children, or for somebody with a living child to be asked, oh, how many kids have you got? And then, well, do I say now that I had a stillbirth and like ruin the vibe, or do I not say it and, deny the existence of my stillborn child, or like, what's the right thing here? And the same person's response might be different on different days, in different circumstances. But anyway, if they do say something, like that is an invitation to engage, and like you're allowed to ask questions then if the topic has been broached. Just definitely don't make what I call silver lining statements. They usually start with at least, oh, at least it was early, at least you can try again, at least you can get pregnant, at least you have another child, like there's some sort of a like for like replacement there. And so I would definitely say whatever you say, try to make it validating of that person's feelings. You don't have to understand why they're sad if they lost a baby at 7 weeks. But if they're telling you they're sad, just take their word for it and come to them where they are, meet them where they are. Avoid platitudes. And yeah, sometimes it should be easier for us to just sit and listen to what somebody else wants to share and tell us. You don't have to fix it. In fact, you can't fix it. If someone tells you their baby died, the worst has already happened. There's nothing on God's green earth you can say or do that's going to somehow undo this, but you can say things that make it a hell of a lot worse.
And tell me, you've advocated for better bereavement leave, postpartum care, and follow up support after pregnancy loss. What changes would you like to see? And can you tell us a little bit about what you've advocated for in that space?
Yeah. So look, things are trending in the right direction, which is good to, Possum Portraits obviously is not the only charity working in this space, to improve circumstances and, systemic inequities, for example, in the employment system. And so recent legislation, for example, has come into force to improve bereavement leave after miscarriage, which was, long overdue. So that's good that we have that now. It's probably not enough, but look, it's a step in the right direction. It acknowledges that it's a thing and that people are allowed to be sad about it, and that you don't have to go to work the day after you have and bloody lose your baby, so things are definitely trending in the right direction in Western countries anyway. We're talking in this sort of, OECD country context here. We're not talking when, a woman in a third world country loses their baby. Obviously is handled, as I understand it, quite differently still. And so, yeah, I think the main intent for Possum Portraits is just to educate the general public that it's okay to talk about loss, that we shouldn't sweep these things under the carpet for the good of society, and to just raise awareness of what things to say and what things not to say, because ultimately those sorts of experiences stay with parents. There's tons and tons of research that shows that the bereavement care that they receive at the time of their loss shapes their health outcomes forthwith. If you received care that you understood to be, or that you felt to be inadequate, or perhaps even, discriminatory or not compassionate, that is going to inform how you process and how you feel about your experience going forward. And so, yeah, we as a charity just want to work to educate people about things that are helpful and not helpful to say, to support parents after loss, so that we have fewer people saying things to bereaved parents that nobody should ever say to anyone in that circumstance. Like we run this Instagram series called Yeah Nah, that features quotes from, like, actual quotes that people have said to bereaved parents, presumably to try and make them feel better. Or sometimes I don't know what the reason for saying things like that was, like, you're a teacher, you can look after other people's kids, like they come from other parts of someone's brain, like, did you think that was going to be a helpful comment? Or yeah, I don't know, you can check out that series. It's absolutely mind-boggling, but in fact, I would almost presume that in no circumstance is that interlocutor trying to be malicious. They're not trying to rub it in. They're not trying to say the wrong thing. They just don't know. They're not thinking, it's kind of a high pressure situation that, like, shit, someone just told me they've had a dead baby. Like, what the hell do I say? And so, yeah, we're trying to help by shaping the environment in which bereaved parents will rejoin society and making sure that everybody's a little bit more clued up about how to support grievers after loss.
And I love that there's also the education around midwives taking photographs. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there's a fantastic charity that goes into hospitals and takes photographs of stillborns, very sick children in ICU, and the children that experienced that suffered neonatal death. But not every parent is eligible for their services. There's a gestational cutoff below which they don't come. If you give birth in a very rural setting, they might not be able to make it. There's situations in which, plenty of situations in which, a volunteer, professional volunteer photographer can't make it to your birth, and then you don't have beautiful photographs. In such situations, it's the midwives that take up the mantle and take those sorts of memorial photographs for you. But obviously, midwives are not photographers, and so it's a very specialist skill, a very technical skill. And so the training program that we have is actually endorsed for continued professional development credits by the Australian College of Midwives. And yeah, we're trying to actually, lots of projects on the go. We're just trying to source some funding to bring those workshops to midwives rather than holding them in a central location where they have to travel to us to take this workshop. We're trying to take it to them, and yeah, where they learn about what angles work, what sorts of pictures you should try and capture for parents. Like definitely the details of facial features, hands, feet. Where the lighting could be to make it softer, about picture composition, things like that. So that almost like a little bit of a tick, like a tick box. Okay, so I've got a picture of the feet. So it's kind of a high stress environment for the midwives as well. And part of that workshop is also showing them how to, avenues they can seek for self care. How to advocate for their own needs in a hospital setting as well. Things like that.
Larissa, given your personal experience and also what you've seen through Possum Portraits, why do you think that, early pregnancy loss, miscarriages, stillbirth, neonatal deaths, why do you think it's such a taboo subject?
Okay, so it's a taboo subject because historically, we haven't really talked about it very much. And so these kinds of attitudes perpetuate, this is self perpetuate really. And they mean that loss tends to be a very isolating experience for parents. Now, even though about 110,000 families experience pregnancy or baby loss in Australia annually, in fact, trending upwards slightly at the moment, the experience of loss is still like a minority occurrence compared to live births. Right. And so partially the experience is isolating because most people do actually get to leave hospital with their baby. And so, often, but the thing that I most often hear from parents who write their story down for our community forum, the Possum blog, is that they wish they had known how common pregnancy loss was, that they wish they had known that it could happen after the first trimester, that the 12-week rule doesn't mean you're going to bring home your baby, and they sort of really fall out of the clouds when it happens to them, like well into the third trimester or even after birth. They're like, but we're in the 21st century. Like, surely, somebody should have told me that there was a risk, or I didn't even realize that this could still happen. And so that's why it's isolating, because often, we don't talk about these things ourselves because we don't want to make other people uncomfortable. And so that means we're not actually aware that maybe, that lady sitting opposite me in the bus might have had a stillbirth, and I would never know about it. 1 in 4 women experience pregnancy loss throughout their lifetime. That's 25%. So you could, conceivably be sitting in a bus with somebody who's had a similar experience and you wouldn't know. And so, yeah, other reasons why it's an isolating experience is, you know, because you sometimes also you don't know who you want to share it with, who you want to talk about it. You don't know how other people are going to react to what you're saying. Are they going to be supportive, or are they going to make you feel worse? And so there's both from the person, from the griever side of you as a point of view, and from other people in society, there's just a little bit of an impasse, a bit of a communication impasse, and all of these things contrive to make it often quite an isolating experience, also because it's very intimate, and all of these aspects contribute to it being a taboo subject. There's another thesis put forward by Isabel Oderberg, who is a journalist and author. She wrote a book called Hard to Bear, Science and Silence of Miscarriage, fantastic book. And She also puts forward a thesis that, because it's a women's issue and it's got something to do with blood and, period blood and like all these sort of like topics that you don't really want to touch, all of these factors contrive to the taboo topic. And that's why it's so important to have open conversations, informative conversations to try and chip away at that taboo and yeah, make it something that is experienced by a hell of a lot of people and that is all right to talk about.
And just on that point, also around those statistics, like given the fact that it historically has been such a taboo topic, that it does involve blood, that it does involve all of those things, that really, we probably really don't truly have the actual statistics because that's only going by what's reported or recorded.
Yeah, absolutely. The dark figure there is enormous. Estimates go that probably it's as high as 150,000 families in Australia. There's definitely reporting errors, or not so much errors as just systemic. How should I say this? Like basically, the systemic processes aren't in place to capture things like miscarriages in particular. Early pregnancy losses. There's also miscarriages, where a woman doesn't even realize she was pregnant. And, all these factors, yeah, contribute to the dark number figure there being quite big. And so the statistics that we are absolutely aware of, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has information or data on these statistics, as does the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. 6 babies are stillborn in Australia every day. 2 pass away as neonates, which means in the first 28 days of life. And a miscarriage happens every 3.5 minutes. So, for anyone who sort of says, oh, this is a bit of a fringe occurrence, it's certainly not. And yet, even with how common it is, it's still something that apparently no one should talk about.
But I think it's interesting what you mentioned there earlier is about, it it does sit with the person who has had the experience. And on any given day, sometimes you may feel like actually sharing, and some days you might not. Because you're so dependent on how that person is that you're sharing that information with. And you may have to actually educate them as well as share your story and then put yourself out there. That's a lot if you're feeling a little bit tired.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, it makes perfect sense that the same person will have different reactions on any given day. I mean, one day you might feel like hot chocolate, and on the other day you might feel like coffee. I mean, which seems like a stupid example, but just as a way of illustrating that, while we are one person, like an individual, depending on how we feel on the day, depending on, what's happened recently, who we're talking to, we're going to react differently about the same thing. And that's perfectly fine. I think we do that in other domains of life. And it's certainly all right to do it in this one.
And I think, as someone who's been listening to hearing you speak about certainly the misconceptions, is that we can all be a little bit kinder and
Mm.
listen a little bit more
Yeah.
before we say anything.
I could not have summarized it better myself. Yeah. It's, people, again, not meaning to be malicious, nobody tries to say the wrong thing, but people often inadvertently say the wrong thing. And people sometimes also, again, not consciously, think that somehow it's about them, but it's not about them. Like you're talking to it's not about you, if you write a text message to somebody who's just lost their baby and they don't write back to you, just give them a break. The idea of supporting someone is not so that you get a message back. It's to show that you're thinking of them. In fact, if you're reaching out to anybody who's lost a baby, in fact, include in your message, if it's a voice message, a phone call, a text message, an email, a letter, whatever it is, a greeting card, write in it. I don't expect you to respond to me if you don't feel up to it. Just take that pressure off them. And so I think sometimes, yeah, inadvertently people are a little bit selfish. Or they also want to know from that griever, oh, I've that they've said the right thing. They somehow want some validation back, and you can't expect that from somebody. And so just cop it on the chin. It's not the worst thing in your life, and it certainly is going to make that the griever's life a hell of a lot easier, not have expectations on them in addition to being completely in another world emotionally at the moment. We can do that. We can all do that if we want to. We can all be better, a little bit more compassionate, empathetic, and not make it about us.
I think that's great insight, Larissa. Thank you. And what is it that you do for your self-care? You mentioned before your multiple hat wearing, and sometimes the personal and the charity get mixed up.
Yeah.
How do you take care of Larissa?
Gosh, yeah, no, it's a juggle. I mean, now I'm a mother of two, so there's that additional person to care for, the juggle with school and work and, your partner, and you're somehow trying to have a relationship and all of this. Yeah, I don't know how well I navigate all the different hats and roles, but I'm not sure that anybody necessarily has any of this figured out. I think everyone's sort of just, kind of figuring it out as they go. That's pretty much what life is, isn't it? So long as you feel, anyway, for me, I think it's so long as I feel, that there's some purpose to what I do, at least that's important to me, that I feel like I'm doing something meaningful with my time. Especially if that time that you spent working means that you don't get to spend it with your children or things you would, otherwise be doing, you better make sure that it's something that fulfills certain aspect of your other wishes or dreams or yeah has some meaning for you because there's a lot of time in this life spent working, so I'm really happy that I found something that I can truly say that I feel committed to and that I enjoy doing and where I see benefit to myself and to others.
And what part of it is it that you love the most? Like you started off as an illustrator.
Yeah.
And
No, look, sometimes it's a bit like, oh, actually, I started this because I wanted to do the art. I wanted to do the
yeah.
book, and now I almost do none of them. We work with 9 different artists throughout Melbourne, and they basically are the portrait gang now. They draw the portraits, and I'm more on the at the back end. The admin side of things, the fundraising, grant writing, project management, that sort of stuff. So, which is how it goes, isn't it? Yeah, just my luck. But even so, I get to grow something I started, which is incredibly rewarding. Seeing it come from strength to strength. I mean, acquiring federal government funding is a gigantic step for a charity. The validation and the legitimacy that comes with receiving government funding is just so rewarding. It's been a hard slog to get here. But yeah, you realize that you can do hard things. Sometimes they work out.
Larissa, I am so happy that you've persevered and stuck at doing the hard things because there's many families that now have a beautiful keepsake of their loved one, which they would never have normally been able to have. So thank you so much for the work that you do and the work that Possum Portraits does.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk on this great podcast.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.